Margaret never thought a dusty attic would hold the answer to the ache she carried for over a decade. It was a Tuesday afternoon, quiet and warm, when James brought the box down. He'd been cleaning out his late mother-in-law's attic. Margaret hadn't set foot in there since the funeral, and nearly tripped over a loose panel behind an old cedar trunk. The box was small, unmarked, but heavy with something more than paper. She barely looked up when he placed it on the kitchen table. But his voice, low and uncharacteristically serious, made her stop mid-stir of her tea. "I think you need to see this." Margaret hesitated, drying her hands on her apron. The moment she lifted the lid, her breath hitched. Dozens of envelopes. Worn corners. Faded ink. And all of them addressed to her. From Ashley. Her hand trembled as she pulled one from the middle. The seal was already broken, the paper soft with age and fingerprints that weren't hers. She unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was instantly familiar. "Dear Mom, I don't know if you're still angry, but I needed you to know, I'm okay. I'm in Seattle now. His name is David. I wish you could meet him." The words blurred as tears welled up. She looked at the postmark, 12 years ago. Letter after letter poured out of that box. Wedding invitations. Holiday cards. Hospital visits. Even a photo of a baby girl with eyes just like hers. One envelope had crayon drawings on it, labeled to Grandma. And she had never seen any of it. Margaret stared at the pile, her heart thudding. One thought looped in her mind like a siren: why? Why didn't I know? Then James said it out loud. "Margaret, do you think your mother ever gave you any of these?" The air in the kitchen thickened. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. She said Ashley never wrote. That she moved on. That I had to do the same. She looked down at the letter in her hand. Ashley hadn't abandoned her. She'd reached out, again and again. The betrayal didn't just come from the past. It had been sitting, festering, inside the very walls of her childhood home. And with that realization came something else. This wasn't over. Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The house smelled like lavender and lemon polish, familiar, warm, deceptive. Margaret stood in the entryway of her mother's home, her jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The box of letters sat in her hands, no longer just paper and ink but the weight of 12 years of silence. Eleanor shuffled into the living room, a bit slower now, leaning on her cane with grace. "Margaret? I wasn't expecting you today." Margaret didn't answer right away. She walked to the coffee table and gently placed the box down. Then, without a word, she opened the lid and pulled out the top letter, the wedding invitation. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Where did you get that?" "I should be asking you that," Margaret said quietly. "You told me Ashley never contacted me. That she left. That she didn't care." Her mother sat down slowly, face unreadable. "I was protecting you." "Protecting me?" Margaret's voice cracked, brittle with disbelief. "By stealing my daughter's letters? By letting me think she abandoned me? She hurt you, Margaret." She stormed out, disrespected everything we tried to give her. "You cried for weeks. You couldn't sleep. What would reading those letters have done, huh? Reopen the wounds? Give you false hope?" "No," Margaret said, louder now. "It would have told me she still loved me. That she didn't vanish into thin air. That she tried." Eleanor looked away, her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't want to see history repeat itself." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" Eleanor exhaled deeply. "Your father left us. When you were 4. He said he was going on a business trip and never came back. I waited. I wrote. I begged. Nothing. I couldn't bear the thought of you being left like that too. When Ashley walked out, it felt the same. I couldn't go through it again. So you made the decision for me," Margaret said, biting each word. You stole the one thing I still had, a chance to heal. There was silence. Then Eleanor whispered, I did what I thought was right. No, you did what was easier, for you. Margaret stood, wiping away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. You don't get to rewrite our history because yours was painful. And then she left, the box in her arms, the truth burning in her chest like fire and ice all at once. But in the pit of that pain was something else now, clarity. She didn't know if Ashley would forgive her. She didn't know if Ashley would even want to see her. But she had to try. She had to find her. She had to begin again. The next morning, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm tea she hadn't touched. James, still in his robe, stood at the stove, watching her with quiet concern. She kept all of them, Margaret said softly, staring at the box of letters now resting beside a bowl of fruit. She never gave up on me. Not for a single year. James came over and sat across from her. So what are you going to do? Margaret didn't answer at first. Instead, she reached for one of the later letters, the one with a photograph tucked inside. A smiling woman, a man beside her, and a baby in her arms. On the back, in Ashley's looping handwriting, it read, her name is Maggie. After you. Margaret's fingers trembled as she ran them over the image. She named her daughter after me, James. I know. I missed her wedding. Her becoming a mother. I missed a decade of her life. James reached across the table and took her hand. But you don't have to miss what comes next. She nodded slowly. I'm going to find her. How? She mentioned Portland in one of the more recent letters, Margaret said, flipping through the pile. She worked at a library there. And she signed one of the notes with a phone number, it might still be hers. James gave a small smile. Let's try it. She picked up the cordless phone, the kind that still beeped when a number was dialed. She pressed each digit with care, as if rushing might shatter the hope flickering inside her. Ring. Ring. A third ring. Then voicemail. Hi, you've reached Ashley Moore. I can't come to the phone right now, but leave a message and I'll get back to you. Margaret froze. Her voice. Older, stronger. But unmistakably Ashley. She tried to speak, but nothing came. She swallowed, then finally whispered, Ashley, it's Mom. I just found your letters. All of them. I didn't know. I didn't know. Silence filled the air after the beep cut her off. James placed a gentle hand on her back. You said what mattered. Margaret took a breath, then walked to her desk, pulled out a fresh piece of paper, and began to write. Not just a note, but a letter. Long, honest, vulnerable. She wrote about the years she spent in silence, about her anger, her grief, her confusion. And then, about the box of letters, and the moment she realized everything had been a lie she didn't ask for. She signed it, with love. Always. Mom. Later that afternoon, James stood with her at the mailbox. You ready? He asked. She hesitated, holding the envelope like it contained her entire heart. Then, without a word, she slipped it into the mailbox and let the lid fall shut. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel paralyzed by regret. She felt the first, fragile thread of hope. 3 days passed. Then 5. Then 10. Each morning, Margaret checked the mailbox with a quiet sort of anticipation that she tried to mask as routine. She would casually stroll out with a cup of coffee in hand, pretending to enjoy the roses along the path, but her eyes were always on the box. Nothing. James didn't ask. He didn't need to. He just made sure to be close, to refill her tea without her asking, to hold her hand during the quiet parts of the evening when neither of them wanted to turn on the TV. Then, on a Wednesday morning that smelled like fresh-cut grass and lavender, Margaret heard the soft ding of her email. She walked past the laptop on the dining table, glancing at the screen, and froze. Subject, we need to talk. The sender, Ashley Moore. She sat down slowly, heart pounding like it hadn't in years. The message was short. Just one sentence. If what you said is true, then there's a lot we need to talk about. I'm free Saturday afternoon. Here's my address. Come alone. Margaret read it 5 times before whispering to herself, she's giving me a chance. That evening, James helped her pack a small overnight bag. Neither of them spoke much. They didn't need to. Everything that mattered was already heavy in the room. When Saturday came, Margaret dressed in her favorite soft blue sweater and slacks. Something that said, "I'm still your mom, but not the one who used to scold or push too hard. Just the one who missed her." The drive to Portland felt longer than it should have, even though the highways were clear. Margaret kept glancing at the GPS, as if it might change its mind and reroute her away from the truth. Finally, she pulled up in front of a small, cheerful house with sunflowers blooming beside the steps. She sat in the car for a minute, staring at the door. Then it opened. Ashley. Older. Her hair longer, streaked with faint copper highlights. Still beautiful. Still her daughter. They both froze, staring. And then, from behind Ashley, a tiny voice piped up, high and sweet. "Mommy, who's that?" Ashley turned slightly, and a little girl with wild curls peeked around her legs. Ashley's voice cracked. "Maggie, this is your grandmother." Margaret's breath caught. The child blinked, then smiled a little. "Grandma," she said softly. Margaret nodded, tears welling. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm your grandma." Ashley stepped aside. "Come in, if you want." Margaret walked up the steps slowly, her heart a hurricane of nerves and longing. She crossed the threshold into a house that smelled of cinnamon and crayons and something she hadn't felt in years. Possibility. Ashley led her to the living room. It was modest but warm, books stacked neatly on a low shelf, a basket of toys tucked into the corner, and art taped to the walls, stick figures with curly hair, suns with smiling faces, flowers in purple and blue. Margaret sat gingerly on the edge of the couch. Ashley remained standing, arms crossed, leaning against the doorframe like she wasn't sure she wanted to stay in the same room. But Maggie, sweet Maggie, climbed right into Margaret's lap as if she'd done it 100 times before. "You smell like cookies," the little girl said. Margaret let out a quiet laugh. "I used to bake them every Sunday." Ashley didn't laugh. She was watching them, mother and daughter separated by years of silence, now bridged by a child who had no idea what her smile was healing. "I still don't know what to believe," Ashley said finally. "Part of me thinks this is some kind of performance. That maybe you're just trying to soothe your own guilt." Margaret didn't defend herself. She looked at her daughter, really looked at her, the hard edges in her jaw, the weariness in her eyes that no woman in her early 30s should have had to carry. "I probably would have thought the same," Margaret said softly. "But I meant every word in that letter. Every word. I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped hoping." Ashley sat down in the armchair across from her. "I wrote to you for years," she said, voice trembling. "Birthdays. Holidays. When David and I got married. When Maggie was born. I kept waiting for you to show up, and you never did." "I didn't know," Margaret whispered. "I swear to you, I didn't know. The letters, my mother took them. Hid them. She said she was protecting me." Ashley blinked. "Grandma?" Margaret nodded, guilt tightening around her chest. "She thought you were going to hurt me. That you'd disappear and leave a scar like my father did to her. She thought she was stopping history from repeating." Ashley looked away, swallowing hard. "So she decided for both of us." Silence settled between them. Heavy. Honest. Then Maggie, ever the peacemaker without knowing it, tugged on Margaret's sleeve. "Can you come to my tea party? It's very important." Ashley hesitated. Margaret glanced at her, seeking silent permission. Ashley gave a small nod. Margaret smiled down at Maggie. "I'd be honored." As the little girl took her hand and led her into a playroom filled with plastic teacups and stuffed animals, Margaret glanced back once more. Ashley was watching. Still guarded. Still wounded. But she hadn't closed the door. Not this time. And that was enough, for now. Later that evening, after Maggie had fallen asleep curled up on the couch with a stuffed giraffe in one arm and a crust of peanut butter sandwich in the other, Ashley offered Margaret a cup of tea. They sat at the kitchen table, two women who had once known everything about each other, now trying to navigate through years of silence and pain. "Do you remember what you said to me the day I left?" Ashley asked, her voice calm but weighted. Margaret stared into her cup. "I said a lot of things I regret. You said I was throwing away my future. That I was being selfish." Margaret nodded slowly. "And I was wrong. Not about being scared, but about how I said it. I let fear speak louder than love." Ashley looked down, running a finger along the rim of her mug. "I kept thinking, if you'd just written one letter. One word. Just once, to say you forgave me, maybe we could have fixed this sooner." "I did," Margaret said softly. "I wrote you so many times. I called, emailed. I even reached out to some of your friends from college. I thought maybe you were ignoring me. I never realized you weren't receiving anything." Ashley exhaled sharply. 12 years, Mom. I had a daughter. I buried a husband. I went through so much, alone, because I thought you didn't care." Margaret's face crumpled. "I cared every single day." The room went quiet again, but not like before. This time, it was the silence of grief being shared instead of carried alone. "I've been seeing a therapist," Ashley said. "Trying to work through things. My anger. My fear. All the guilt about Maggie not having a grandmother." "I'd be honored to be in her life," Margaret said, eyes shining. "In whatever way you're comfortable." Ashley hesitated, then looked up. "She liked you. She doesn't warm up to strangers easily." A flicker of hope. "I don't expect everything to be healed overnight," Margaret said. "But I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere." Ashley nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "I want to believe that." "You don't have to believe it yet," Margaret replied gently. "Just let me keep showing up." From the hallway, James' voice called softly, "You two okay?" Ashley wiped her eyes and managed a small smile. "Yeah. We're okay." And for the first time in years, Margaret felt that maybe, just maybe, they would be. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the soft curtains of Ashley's living room as Margaret stood at the kitchen counter, pouring cereal into a small pink bowl. Maggie sat at the table, feet swinging, her curly hair a halo of golden light. "Do you want strawberries on top, sweetheart?" Margaret asked gently. Maggie nodded. "And honey, please." Ashley leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed, watching them. There was something almost surreal about seeing her mother in her kitchen, barefoot, hair slightly tousled, making breakfast like she'd always been there. "Mom," Ashley said quietly, "do you have time today? I mean, to come with us to Maggie's ballet class? Parents are allowed to watch." Margaret turned, surprised and moved. "I'd love that." Later that day, as they sat on tiny plastic chairs in a pastel-colored studio, Margaret watched Maggie twirl in her little pink leotard. Her heart swelled, not just with love, but with a quiet grief for the years she'd missed. "She's really good," Margaret whispered. Ashley glanced sideways. "She's obsessed with dancing. Her dad used to play music and lift her up like she was flying." Margaret reached over, gently touching her daughter's hand. "He sounds like he was a good man." Ashley nodded, eyes glistening. "He was. And, he would have wanted Maggie to know her family. All of it." That evening, they visited Eleanor's house. The air was heavy with unspoken tension, but Margaret had called ahead. "She wants to see you," she'd told her mother. "And Maggie." Eleanor opened the door slowly, her frame smaller than Margaret remembered. Time had softened her edges, but not the guilt in her eyes when she saw Ashley. "Hi, Grandma," Maggie said brightly, holding up a daisy she'd picked in the yard. Eleanor's lips trembled. She knelt down slowly, taking the flower. "Well, aren't you just a beam of sunshine?" Ashley stayed silent as they entered. Margaret led them to the living room, where the air felt dense with memory. Eleanor looked at her daughter and granddaughter as if she was afraid they might vanish. "I never meant to hurt anyone," Eleanor said finally. "I thought I was protecting you, Margaret. From being abandoned the way I was. I didn't realize I was becoming the one doing the abandoning." Ashley spoke softly. "You didn't just hurt her. You hurt me, too." Eleanor wiped her eyes. "I know. And I'm sorry." There was silence. Not forgiving silence, not yet. But listening silence. Margaret reached over, placing her hand over Eleanor's. "We can't go back," she said, "but maybe we can stop carrying it all forward." Ashley nodded slowly. "One step at a time." Eleanor looked at her granddaughter again, her eyes now overflowing. "I missed so much," she whispered. Ashley's voice cracked. "So did we." And in that quiet living room, with 3 generations of women who had hurt and been hurt, something invisible began to mend. 1 week later, Margaret sat at her dining table, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands as Ashley stepped through the doorway, carrying a small photo album. Maggie trailed behind her, hugging a plush giraffe. "I thought you might like to see this," Ashley said, placing the album gently on the table. Margaret opened it slowly. Inside were snapshots of the years she'd missed: Ashley's wedding day, hospital photos with newborn Maggie, birthdays, Christmas mornings, and quiet moments, Ashley holding her daughter's tiny hand as they walked on the beach. Every picture was a reminder of a life that had gone on without her. And yet, the fact that these pages now rested in her hands was proof that it wasn't too late. Margaret looked up, her voice thick. "You saved all of this?" Ashley nodded. "Even when I was angry, I still hoped someday you'd want to see it." "I do," Margaret whispered. "More than anything." That afternoon, they visited the community center near Ashley's home. Maggie was participating in a storytelling event, and when it was her turn, she stood proudly in front of the small crowd, holding up a drawing of 3 women holding hands. "This is me," she said, pointing to the smallest figure. "This is my mommy. And this is my grandma. We're like a chain. Even if one part breaks, it can be fixed." Margaret felt her heart twist. Eleanor, sitting beside her, reached for her hand. "I don't deserve this chance," Eleanor said, voice trembling. "No," Margaret replied gently. "But neither did I. And yet, here we are." Later that evening, the 3 women, Margaret, Ashley, and Eleanor, stood side by side in the kitchen, preparing dinner together for the first time in over a decade. Maggie sat on the counter, giggling as flour dusted her nose. It wasn't perfect. There were still wounds healing, words unsaid, fears lingering in the spaces between their conversations. But there was laughter. There was movement. There was love trying to grow again. And that was enough for now. Thank you for staying with us through this deeply emotional journey. Margaret's story is a powerful reminder that family wounds may take years to heal, but healing is always possible, if we choose truth and forgiveness. What would you do if your mother hid your child's letters for over a decade? Do you believe Margaret did the right thing? Share your thoughts in the comments. Comment 2 if you believe in second chances. Comment 7 if you think some betrayals can't be forgiven. Like this video if it moved you. And don't forget to subscribe to EN True Tales so you don't miss our next life-changing story, coming tomorrow.